The study is entitled Romans 14 Unplugged, Feasts and Fasts and Food, Oh My. So if you look at my screen right now, we've been talking in Romans 14. Remember, there's a section there where Paul says one person esteems one day, one person esteems another day, everybody should be fully convinced, one person observes a day, and things like that. You guys remember from the liturgy, Romans 14 verses 5 and 6. That's the topic. And so what we've ascertained is that historically, generally speaking, the popular translations and interpretations of this section of our Bible lead us to a conclusion that Paul is basically abrogating Torah observance, which would include Sabbath, seventh-day Sabbath, and he's really allowing for the churches that he's establishing, the largely Gentile Christian churches, to formulate whatever holy days they would like based on a kind of maybe a popular vote or a personal opinion. And what we found is that historically, contextually, and theologically, it's probably not the safest way to interpret these passages. I'm not discounting the fact that there is some application where certain ways and bylaws and meeting times that where we get together as Christians that Paul certainly wouldn't want us to take votes and make sure that we're all on board with whatever leadership deems which days are important. The point I'm simply trying to make is that it is highly unlikely that Paul is using the Sabbath as this test case, or that he's directly applying this part of his letter to the holy days that were all established by Moshe 1,500 years earlier. And so that's the premise that we're going with. So let's just read through my conclusions, and you'll begin to see what I'm talking about. We're going to finish this tonight, by the way, so that next week we're poised to begin asking this question, start turning to this topic: who is the brother of Romans 14, specifically to section 10 through 13. And why it matters to us is because if the brother are Christians, then perhaps maybe there's no need for us to even concern ourselves with non-Messianic Jews who we might encounter in our travels per se. But if in Paul's day, non-Christian Jews were actually still part of the larger faith community, then the term brother is broadened, and it takes on a slightly different nuance than we're used to hearing when we think of the word brother. So we'll begin to look at that next week, but don't want to jump ahead just too quickly. For now, let's start with our conclusions. Again, this is a conclusion to the section on the topic about Sabbath versus Sunday. Is Paul talking about a Sabbath issue when he's talking about these special days? So here's what my commentary has to say. Quote, "There's no historical evidence or theological support from the first century to suppose that Romans 14:5 should be interpreted as a freedom to choose worship days. There just really isn't anything from history that lends this particular support. In other words, it seems to fit our modern proclivities as Gentile Christians to feel that we're free from any vestiges of Torah observance or anything that smacks of Judaism or something that would obligate us to what we term Old Testament or Old Dispensation or something. We feel like if we're keeping the law, then we feel like we're going backwards and not forward. We're not being progressive as Christians. We're going back under the law, which is somehow equated with under legalism or under bondage, as if keeping God's laws is legalism or something to that effect. But there doesn't seem to be any historical evidence or theological support, as I mentioned, that this is what Paul is talking about. The early Messianic communities were, if you remember, a sect of Judaism, right? A break-off, an offshoot of Judaism. Read Acts 24:14. They called themselves followers of the Way, which was a sect of Judaism. They weren't a brand new religion known as Christianity, is the point I'm trying to make. They eventually did get labeled as Christians, at least maybe 2 or 3 times in the apostolic scriptures. But the point is, even Rome would have forbade new religions from starting up under the emperor's premise that the emperors themselves were demigods or gods to be worshipped, and bringing in another religion that was not sanctioned or recognized by Rome would have been tantamount to some form of treason against the emperor, right? You're bringing in another god, you're worshiping him, and what about emperor worship? What about recognizing the emperor's worship? The only group at the time of Paul's writing that enjoyed what we might call they were excluded from having to, in other words, from having to do emperor worship. They had a kind of an allowance, as it were. The Greek word is a collegia. They were it was the Judaisms. They were allowed to have a measured amount of autonomy. They could worship their own God, right, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and not have to worship the emperor's God, but they still had to pray for the emperor and pay a heavy amount of tax for that religious, what's the word I'm looking for? Freedom, that religious exemption. That's the word I was looking for. They had this religious exemption, and it was levied against them in the form of the Fiscus Judaicus. So all that to say simply, bringing in another new religion known as Christianity, willy-nilly, wouldn't really have worked in Paul's day. You were either a part of Rome's religions, the pantheon of gods, or you were a part of Judaic religion, the monotheistic Jewish religion. There was no Islam. There was no Catholic Christianity at the time. There wasn't any Orthodox Christianity. There was no Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses around. There was no SDAs around at the time. None of that. There was no Protestantism at the time, right? There were other world religions, Buddhism and things like that, but there's different parts of the world. We're talking about the Middle East. So let's continue. Even a surface level examination of the chapter will show that food and eating topics were the primary context, right? Do this on your own. Go back and read Romans 14 verses 2, 3, 6, 14, 15, 17, 20, 21, and 23, just to name a few of them, right? The context is about food. Why would he suddenly switch to Sabbath days? Doesn't make any sense. All right, so based on the context being food, a special day that's tied to food would make it what? Let's keep reading. This would make Romans 14, 5 and 6 about voluntary fast days, right? That has to do with food. That some were esteeming, while others not obligating themselves to those voluntary fast days. And why not? There's nothing in the Torah that mandates a fast day other than perhaps Yom Kippur as a mandatory community fast day. But other than that, there weren't any mandatory biblically commanded fast days, and thus each community could determine which days were fast days, and each individual member within a community could also say, I have my own special fast day for X amount of reasons. And thus, there wasn't an opportunity for anyone, either community versus community or individual versus individual within a community, to levy any judgment against each other over something that is not mandatory in the Torah to begin with. You understand the logic behind making this about voluntary fast days instead of making it about something like the Sabbath, which was obviously community mandated by God himself. It was a command from the top, right? These orders came from the top down. It wasn't Moshe's invention to bring the Sabbath into the picture. It was God's instruction. Here, God says to Moshe, these are my special days. Sabbath is just one of them. The festivals would be the others. These are my special days. You disseminate this information to the people, to the leaders, and make sure that this information goes into the community and that they implement these, put them into practice, safeguard them, right? Remember, it talked about the word shomer in the liturgy. Safeguard them internally first, and then implement them as a community. Make sure you're actually walking them out on the outside. You have to actually do them. Set your calendar so that you're actually walking into them and doing them. This is not something that was voluntary. It was not put up for a vote. It was not something that each person was supposed to be, and I'm using air quotes with my fingers for those who can't see me. It was not something that was supposed to be left for each one to be fully convinced in his own mind. That was not the case when it comes to Sabbath. The idea is that the children of Israel in many ways were like an employer-employee relationship, and God was making the rules, and as the employer, and Israel being the employee would have to follow those rules because they were covenantally bound, contractually bound to keep those particular rules. And part of it was like that relationship. We could also make a relationship like children are to parents. The parents don't say to the children, Johnny, who's 10 years old or maybe 5 years old, doesn't matter, somewhere around that age, right? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Johnny, do you want to clean your room today? Are you fully convinced that you should be cleaning your room today? Or would you rather go out and play? You and your sister, Sarah, who's also just a few years older or younger than you, you guys discuss it amongst yourselves and come to a decision whether you want to clean your room or you want to go out and play with your friends. And whatever decision you guys come to, just be fully convinced about it, and I'll go with that. Is that what mom and dad say? It doesn't work that way. Is it because their relationship is not employer-employee? No, it doesn't work that way either. It's because parent to children, we already know that the instructions go from parent down to child, and the children don't have a choice in the matter. They are to receive the instruction from their parents. There's also that aspect of Israel to God. They are the children, and God is the parent. But keep in mind that also we're talking about a different metaphor of employer to employee. So a lot of that, there's contractual obligations, but there's also just the respect from parent down to children. So let's keep this in context. Let's keep reading. Let me scroll up a little bit here. Starting right here, I say, and within the sometimes heated social setting of the first century Judaisms, issues related to food, special days, and ritual purity were a natural flashpoint for friction between the merging of the Jewish culture and those from the nations who were grafted into remnant Israel. Read Romans 11, 17, and 15, 5 through 7. So we have Gentiles and Jews being thrust together in a mix where we've got to work this thing out together as fellow covenant members. Now, we've got our differences historically, we've got our differences culturally, we've got our differences religiously. And yet, because we're all naming the one God, the God of Israel, and some of us naming the name of Messiah, others not, yet still we're all one covenant family. Gentiles are brought into the family via their faith in Messiah, but this brings them into the family relationship with Abraham as their father, even though they're Gentiles, and it brings them into a relationship with God as their maker, their creator, their savior. Understand what I'm talking about? Jews were already enjoying this covenant membership under God through faith in God as walked out through covenant faithfulness and loyalty to Torah. But along come Gentiles who bring in also their faith in God, along with their faith in Messiah. The point I'm trying to emphasize is that their faith in Messiah did not separate them and make them a separate group so that they did not have to obligate themselves to the same faith in God, loyalty to Torah, and recognition that the Jewish people were their co-covenant partners in this franchise together as worshipers of the one God of Israel. It was one God. So that's the point I'm trying to make. Let's read these last few paragraphs. Let me scroll up a bit. Right here, I have to say, in this day and age, believers are free to worship on whatever day the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, leads them to worship on. Don't get me wrong. You can worship wherever the Spirit leads you. However, here's my proviso, it would be wise at least to establish a regular schedule, pattern, and location of worship so that one could become accountable to a local congregation if at all possible. We don't want Lone Rangers just creating any type of worship schedule with no accountability to anyone and no cohesion, no group affiliation. You're going to put yourself in danger if you're just going to go out there on your own and say, I'm not going to group with anybody. I'm not going to meet in a group. I'm not going to meet with people. I'm just going to worship God whenever the Spirit leads me. Today it might be Monday. Tomorrow it might be Friday. The next day it might be Wednesday. It's just a coin toss, a flip of the dice, right? No one knows which day is my worship day. It's whatever I feel led in the Spirit to worship on. And if you do that, you're not really going to be in a position where you're not going to be able to fellowship with anybody, because you're not going to find any other church denominations that follow that same type of theology that you're following. That's the point I'm trying to make. So I continue. Biblical freedom is not a license to church hop as often as one pleases. To this degree, there may be no rigid right or wrong answer to this particular question. I go on to say, I don't personally agree with using Romans 14:5 to justify a choice in worship days, since I believe the context to be that of voluntary fast days instead. All right, and then this last paragraph, which will close out this section, I have to say, lastly, regardless of how one interprets Romans 14:5, we can be assured that Paul forbids the weak and the strong from judging and despising each other, since they constitute one viable community and are in need of one another. Read Romans 14:1-4, 10, and 13. Also, Paul definitely admonishes the strong to welcome, that is Romans 14:1, and bear with the failings of the weak and to accommodate their opinions, Romans 15:1. We'll talk a little bit more about who the weak are and who is your brother next week. But in closing, I say we're to admonish one another. The strong have the most of the responsibility to welcome and to bear with, right? Most of the letter is actually, this part of the letter is aimed at the strong, since they're the ones who are spirit-led and the ones who are naturally going to be expected to carry that particular responsibility. The weak typically aren't going to be that way. While each is to build the other up, Romans 15:2-7, and to avoid destroying the work of God for the sake of food, Romans 14:2. So in the end, while we're going to have our differences over which days are special and which days aren't, whether we're talking about Sabbath versus Sunday, which I think isn't really the issue, or whether we're talking about fast days versus non-fast days, right? Whatever way we slice and dice this particular chapter of Paul, we're going to have to come to agreement on the fact that in the end, we need to welcome one another, bear with each other's failings and differences, accommodate each other's opinions, and build each other up in Messiah, and avoid destroying one another for petty differences that are certainly not spelled out as black and white in the Torah. Amen. Amen. Okay, that'll do it for the Romans 14 study for tonight. Next week, we'll begin to look at this question, who is the brother in this particular passage? And we're going to entertain the challenging question as to whether or not the brother is exclusively Christian, right, Jews and Gentiles, or could it be that Paul's actually allowing for this word brother to have a broader meaning to include Jews and Gentiles as brother covenant members, even though some of those covenant members are only on one level of covenant obedience, that is to say, they have a faith in God, but the other person has the extended level of covenant membership, meaning they have faith in Messiah. Yet both are still brothers because the commonality between the two is that they both have a faith in God. Could this be seen and allowable in this phrase, brother? We'll look at that next week.